law and the character of God. And we'll just jump straight into it. Hopefully I'll get this. Yeah. If you were to, the structure I'm going to use is just 7 points, so I'll be going through them fairly quickly. We're going to look at what is God's character. Then we'll have a look at what is love. Sit on. Yeah? Are you okay? Can you hear okay? Yeah? Good. All right. And then we'll go into what type of law is love. Then the question at the heart of the great controversy, God's solution to the problem of sin, the significance of obedience, and then a couple of implications. So it's quite a bit, but we'll get through it fairly quickly. If you were to think of a text that describes God's character, I think the one you would most likely use would be Exodus 34. You remember the story where Moses is asked to see God's glory. God comes and reveals himself, reveals his glory by telling his name. He passes by and he says this: the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. You know, some have said that this is the Bible's most favorite text about itself because it's repeated most often in the Bible. You'll find parts of this repeated in Numbers, in Nehemiah, in the Psalms, quite a few of the Psalms, in Daniel and in Joel. So this seems to be the ultimate description of God's character. In the New Testament, I think it would be summarized in the words of 1 John 4, God is love. So, that being the case, what is love? Again, if I was to ask you to give me a text that tells you what is love, most of us would most likely give 1 Corinthians 13, and we know the words that are there. Love is patient, it's kind, doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it doesn't dishonor others, etc., etc. It's not self-seeking. Notice everything about love is centered on somebody else. It's other-centered. It's looking about the good of the other. That's what love is. It's other-centered. As opposed to what sin would be, which is me-centered. Can you think? Imagine a system where everybody's thinking about everybody else. It's no problem. You don't have to think about yourself because everybody's thinking about you anyway. And you're just passing that on constantly. But the moment one person starts to say, I want it for me, it destroys the whole system, which is what sin does. Sin is self-centered rather than other-centered. Love is also what I would suggest, it's the law of life. God is love, yes. And whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. Whenever we're living in love, we're living in the character, what God is like. And as it says in Romans 8, through Christ, the law of the Spirit of life set me free from the law of sin and death. This law of love is the law of life for the universe, and that's what keeps life going. It's as if God has designed the universe to function in harmony with his own character. You'd expect that, right? That God would create a universe that functions the way he is, which is based on love. It's like love is woven into all the fabric of how the universe is meant to function. In other words, life is only consistent with love. So the opposite, the polar opposite, sin and death, comes from selfishness. Life can only come in a context of love. That's the way God has designed the universe to function. And that's why Jesus says in John 15, if you keep my commands, you remain in my love. You're part of what I am all about, my character. And that's what he did. He remained in his Father's love all of his life. So that being the case, what type of law is love? Now, when you think about the philosophy of law, there are basically only two laws. There is what are known as prescriptive laws. They are generally, you make them up, yes, they're arbitrarily made, with externally imposed penalties attached to them. All the laws that we make up are generally these kind of laws. They are prescriptive. Which means then that they're temporary. You can change them when you like, because you're only prescribing penalties to them. For example, the speed limit. You can change the penalty for the speed limit, according to whatever you may want to do as a government. There's no natural consequence generally of driving 35 in a 30 zone. But if the police catch you, you get a penalty prescribed to you. They're prescriptive laws. The other type of law is descriptive. These are those processes that have kind of inherent consequences attached to them. They're part of the way God has designed life to work here on planet Earth. So they're unchangeable. They have intrinsic results to them. For example, the law of gravity. If I was to step off the roof of a 10-story building, I will not go up. It's down. Nobody's going to have to put me to death. Nobody's going to have to put a pen. I'm going to have to kill Patrick now because he did that. No. The natural consequence is I will die. Descriptive laws. They describe what the natural consequences will be of breaking them. And actually, it's really interesting because within criminal law, you've got the same two categories. They break them down into two types. So you've got malum in se laws and you've got malum prohibitum. Malum prohibitum means wrong due to being prohibited. In other words, because we've made a law about it, if you break it, that's wrong. Prohibited. Yeah? But the malum in se laws are wrong in themselves. In other words, they violate the natural, moral, and public principles of a society. So they're the two types of laws. Malum prohibitum, which are basically prescriptive, and malum in se, which are descriptive laws. So the question comes then, what type of law is love? Is it prescriptive or descriptive? When you break the law of love, is that malum prohibitum or malum in se? And that, I believe, comes to the heart of one of the most fundamental questions in the great controversy. What type of law does God run his universe on? Descriptive laws or prescriptive laws? In other words, are they natural with natural consequences, or does God impose penalties on you if you break his laws? And if we go to Genesis 3, 1-5, I think we see basically what the accusations of God's enemy are. You know the story, so we don't really need to read that again. But you'll notice here, there are basically four things that happen. The serpent comes along and says, so did God really put you in this beautiful garden with all these trees and say you cannot touch any of them? That's a pretty random, arbitrary thing to say, isn't it? And of course she says, no, he didn't say that. We can eat any one we like, except that one in the middle. Shouldn't eat it, shouldn't touch it, otherwise we're going to die. Oh, and he says, you won't die. There's no natural consequence from eating from this fruit. How does he know that? Maybe he's touching it. Maybe he even takes a bite and says, see, I'm still alive. There's no natural consequence. Oh, he may put you to death because he's punitive, but there's nothing natural will happen from eating the fruit. And he knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like him. You see, he's selfish. He doesn't want you to be like him. And so the end result is saying that God is untrustworthy. And that's what happens with sin. We start to distrust God. So in other words, what he's trying to insinuate, God's enemy, is that God's laws are like human laws. They're arbitrarily made. You have to police them so that if people do something wrong, then you've got to punish them with externally imposed punishments on them. In other words, God runs his universe on prescriptive law. And it's interesting, Ellen White kind of summarizes this in one way in Patriarchs and Prophets when she says, from the first, the great controversy had been upon the law of God. Satan had sought to prove that God was unjust, that his law was faulty, and that the good of the universe required it to be changed. We shouldn't have his way of doing life. In attacking the law, he aimed to overthrow the authority of its author. In the controversy, it was to be shown whether the divine statutes were defective and subject to change, or perfect and immutable. So really, at the back of all this is the suggestion that if the law can be changed, then God can be changed. And if he won't change, let's get rid of him and put me in place instead, says Satan. But of course, the thing is, God says, like in Malachi 3, I don't change. And so, we've got to make this decision then. This is what's going on in this whole debate. Can we trust God or not? Should we change God out for a different system? Because God is love and he's built the whole system on himself. His law is love. Maybe we should just change him out and put another system in place. And so because distrust now is in the human family, how does God solve the situation? Well, we're told in Genesis 3:15, Jesus is going to come and solve it. And I'd like to suggest that Jesus came to demonstrate that God's system, God's law, is the best way to run the universe by. The law of love, which, again, is all about God's character and the way he is. The law of love is the best way to run the whole universe. That's what Jesus came to show. He does it at least in three ways. First of all, he keeps God's law all the way through. Remember when he says in John 15, I have obeyed my Father's command and remain in his love. He's shown all through his life, we can as humans live according to love all the way through. That's what he came to do. He stayed in God's love. Never once did he do one selfish thing. He stayed within God's love, perfectly obeyed this law of other-centeredness. Second thing, and you see other texts here as well that he's saying, can any of you prove me guilty of sin? And we know he came to deal with the whole sin problem. The second thing he did was to, by his death, to show that the law of sin and death is not something that is arbitrarily placed on us. Remember when he says, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Because that's what it is. Sin means being separated from God. And thirdly, he came to reintroduce trust into the human system. Because he died in trust in his Father. Why have you forsaken me? Okay, I can't see. But Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. I trust you anyway. To his dying breath, he trusted God. See, God made him sin. He treated Jesus like sin so that we could be treated according to the righteousness of God. God left him alone to die. And so I want to just briefly touch on then the significance of obedience. Because, as Adventists, we're really concerned with what it says in Revelation that here are they who keep the commandments of God. Talk to Adventists, the commandments of God are all about the 10 Commandments, and that we've got to keep those and we've got to do those well. So what is obedience all about? What is God asking for when he asks us to obey? Well, I'd like to suggest that it's all about developing character. And you could say there are like 3 stages of obedience. The beginning stage of obedience, we get obedience because we help our children through rewards and punishments. When children are young, they don't know the consequences of their choices. So you just tell them, do it because I said so. And I think that's kind of what God did in Exodus 20. When he spoke the 10 commandments to the people, he shook the mountain and it was on fire and people were dead scared. And they said, everything you say, we will do it. Fear and punishment. Yes, reward and punishment is what we do for our children. If you brush your teeth, you will get, etc. A reward. They will do it for the reward, not because they think brushing their teeth is such a wonderful thing. But if you get a reward, okay. Yeah, that's a very basic way of treating commands. The most basic, fundamental way of getting obedience. But hopefully then you grow in maturity, and then you get to the place where you want to obey in order to please that person. And I think this is expressed by David in Psalm 19. May these words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's better than just being forced to do things through rewards and punishment. Now you want to please the person, but they're not necessarily a part of who you are. There's still an external kind of motivation. I would say the most mature place to come to when it comes to obedience is obeying because I agree with this. Whether it was a law or not, I would do it anyway because it's the best way to live. I think that's what's being described in Ezekiel 36, where God says, I'm going to put my law in your heart to move you to want to do these things. It becomes a part of who you are, part of your character, that you want to just do this naturally anyway. Putting my spirit in you to move you to be like me, basically, is what God is saying. In other words, I think God wants us to move to the place where our obedience isn't about keeping commands in order to earn merit. All the problems we have with people trying to think of, perfectionism, and I've got to do this in order, it would disappear if we understand where God's trying to take us. in terms of our character development. Because obedience is never about keeping the rules. That's never what God has ever been intending to do. It's rather about becoming like him, where love is the rule of our lives, where it's part of who we are. It's part of our character. So a couple of brief implications about all of this. First of all, remember Deuteronomy 6. Moses talking to Israel and saying, Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Get to that place of maturity where that's your natural inclination. And he says, these commands I've given you today. And remember in Deuteronomy 5, he's gone through the 10 commandments again. And the mantra that's coming through is, please obey these laws. Obey them, obey them. He says, let them be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them all the time. Put them on your doorposts, etc. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your forehead. In other words, even from Israel, God was always trying to transform them into becoming like him. But there is a sinister side to this, in a sense, because we're told in the book of Revelation that there is coming powers that will try to imitate God's type of obedience. Also about receiving marks on hands and foreheads. It's about how we are obeying. In other words, there is counterfeit obedience. Because what you're seeing in Revelation 13 is a lot of counterfeit of what God's trying to do. There's counterfeit obedience. In other words, what kind of obedience do we actually give God? Let me give you an example. Someone recently made me aware of something called theonomy. I'd never heard of it. Just a couple of weeks ago, they told me about this. Theonomy is based on two Greek words, theos, God, and nomos, which is law, God's law. It's the idea, it's a growing idea within evangelicalism, actually, that civil governments should rule according to God's divine laws. That the 10 Commandments should be enforced. Is that a good idea? You know, if Adventists were the majority here in the UK, if we had 70% of the population, should we start enforcing Sabbath keeping? Is that what we should be doing? Get people to obey God's law. Or would that be more of the false type of obedience? And maybe that tells us that enforcing church discipline may not necessarily be the way God wants us to go. Enforcing compliance perhaps is not God's kind of obedience, but a counterfeit one. There are some implications for this, for us. And one other implication. What should be the main emphasis of the gospel? We talk about the gospel constantly. Generally, there's three ways in which we think about the way it's portrayed. One way that's often portrayed is that we've broken the rules, God's angry with us. So we've got to placate God's anger. He told us not to, and we did, and he's angry. That really is the basis of all heathen worship. Trying to placate an angry God. We've broken the rules and we're in legal trouble. This is a very popular way in which we think about what the gospel is. that Jesus has come to get us out of the legal trouble we're in, because God's got to now impose his penalty of death on us. Again, that is a prescriptive way of thinking about the gospel. I'd like to suggest that the way in which the gospel then would be preached is that we've been deceived by lies. And we've tried all kinds of substitutes for God, and it's just been chaos. And what God's trying to do is win us back to trust in him. Because if we trust in him again, then he can heal all the damage that sin has done to us. He can write his way of doing life, the law of love, into our characters. And then he can grow us to become more and more like him. And then, as Jesus says, then this gospel of the kingdom will be preached as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Thank you.